Even if the Orphan Drug Act were working properly, its enormous costs might outweigh its minimal benefits. But it's not working properly. Drug manufacturers are gaming the act in at least 3 important ways. They're the topic of this week's Healthcare Triage. 3 ways to game the Orphan Drug Act: recycling, pushing products for unapproved uses, and salami slicing. Let's begin. We'll start with recycling. Here's the game. Find a cheap drug with lapsed patents that is approved for one indication but is widely used off-label for an orphan disease. Run the drug through clinical trials for that disease and get the FDA to approve it for the new indication. Voila! You've got 7 years of market exclusivity under the Orphan Drug Act. Then you jack up the price. This happens a lot. One recent study, for example, surveyed all of the drugs, 9 in the United States, 2 in the EU, that have received orphan drug approval for rare seizure conditions. They were not new drugs. Instead, they were, and I'm quoting, mainly compounds that were already approved to treat epilepsy or alternative routes of application for already approved orally available compounds. Similar concerns have been raised with respect to rare neurological diseases, including 3,4-DAP, which we discussed last week. There's some social value in clinical trials that demonstrate the safety and efficacy of off-label uses, but the point of the Orphan Drug Act was to reward novel research, not to foster the recycling of existing drugs. 7 years of market exclusivity is a blunt and excessive reward for trials that we could run much more cheaply. Gaming method number 2, unapproved uses. Recycling isn't the only trick manufacturers have up their sleeve. They can also secure approval for an orphan drug and exploit their 7 years of exclusivity to market their products for unapproved uses. This kind of regulatory bait and switch may partially explain the paradox that so many blockbuster drugs are also orphan drugs. A 2012 study by Aaron Kesselheim and others found that off-label use of orphan drugs is rampant. The lidocaine patch, for example, was approved to treat painful hypersensitivity and chronic pain in post-therapeutic neuralgia, but it's prescribed 82.3% of the time for different uses entirely. For just 4 orphan drugs from 1999 to 2005, researchers concluded that state Medicaid programs spent a combined $495 million on off-label uses. The Orphan Drug Act plays a complex role in this dynamic. Most orphan drugs, at least the non-recycled ones, are patented. Lidocaine, for example, was under patent during the study period. A patent already allows the manufacturer to get approval for one indication and secure a chokehold on the market for off-label uses. Regulatory exclusivity under the Orphan Drug Act may still be valuable, given the possibility of a patent challenge, but it makes less of a difference than is sometimes assumed. Things get more complicated when an orphan drug doesn't have a patent. In that case, whether a manufacturer can dominate the market for off-label uses depends on whether the drug was previously approved for a different indication. Although competitors can't market the drug for an orphan indication, they can still market the drug for that earlier approved indication. They've just got to use skinny labels that omit information about the orphan use. When skinny label generic drugs are in the market, sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, the orphan drug and the skinny labeled drug can compete for off-label uses. If a non-patented orphan drug hasn't previously been approved, then orphan drug approval does give the manufacturer a clear field to market the drug for off-label uses. A competitor could always attempt to secure approval for a different indication, but in general, no competitor will have adequate incentives to do so in the absence of patent protection. The third method of gaming, salami slicing. Many common diseases have subtypes, and manufacturers can seek to approve a drug either for the broader disease or for these subtypes. When some of these subtypes can be characterized as orphan diseases, the manufacturer may be tempted to seek approval for one subtype after another, earning 7 years of marketing exclusivity for each new approval. As a result, a drug that's targeted at a population much larger than 200,000 people can call itself an orphan. Take cancer, for example. Physicians at Johns Hopkins recently wrote about how drug manufacturers strategically exploit variations in cancer etiology to secure approval of orphan indications. We're quoting, "The convergence of the organ and gene models of cancer means that almost any cancer medication can be maneuvered into an orphan disease category. For example, the proto-oncogene HER2 is most commonly associated with breast cancer. However, HER2 can also be found in glioblastomas, non-small cell lung cancer, gastric tumors, adenoid cystic carcinomas of the parotid gland, pancreatic cancer, and ovarian cancer. Each of these organ-based cancer types can be further substratified by classifying them into HER2 positive and HER2 negative cancers. So if you're a drug manufacturer, you slice the cancer salami, securing approval after approval for different cancers. Take trastuzumab, or Herceptin, for example, which has been approved to treat HER2 positive breast cancer, not an orphan disease. But the drug has also been approved to treat HER2 positive pancreatic cancer and HER2 positive gastric cancer, both of which are orphans. Salami slicing raises at least 4 concerns. First, granting 7 years of market exclusivity for every new disease subset allows manufacturers to extend their drug monopolies. It's not quite right to say, as the Johns Hopkins researchers do, and quoting again, extreme prices are made possible by that exclusivity. The patent system already grants a monopoly to at least some of these drugs, so it's also the patent system's fault. But for drugs with weak patents or whose patents have lapsed, the Orphan Drug Act is to blame. Second, a practice of seeking approval for disease subtypes will result in fewer clinical trials on whether a drug works for the disease as a whole. Without those trials, many patients who could benefit from the drug won't receive treatment. Third, Phase 3 clinical trials for orphan drugs are less intensive than for conventional drugs, enrolling about 1/3 as many patients. For true orphan drugs, that's probably okay. Reducing the stringency of FDA approval may encourage their development. But easing up on drugs that aren't actually orphans will mean a general reduction in the quality of clinical trials. Fourth, salami slicing may enable a manufacturer to maintain market exclusivity for off-label uses even when the drug is no longer patented. When a cluster of orphan drug designations makes it difficult for a generic to gain a toehold, generic manufacturers may lack adequate incentives to bring a competitor to market. And without generic competition, an orphan drug has a lock in the market for both approved and off-label uses. In other words, the original manufacturer eats the whole sandwich. So yes, drug manufacturers are systematically gaming the Orphan Drug Act. What can we do about that? Tune in to the next episode of Healthcare Triage. Healthcare Triage is supported in part by viewers like you through Patreon.com, a service that allows you to support the show through a monthly donation. Your support makes this show bigger and better. We'd especially like to thank our research associates Joe Sevitz and Jonathan Dunn, and of course our Surgeon Admiral Sam. Thanks Joe, Jonathan, and Sam. More information can be found at patreon.com/healthcaretriage.